Mickey Rooney was blessed. He was blessed with his talent as an actor. He was blessed with his health. So all things considered, though his decisions were awful, God was apparently looking out after him, and it wasn't as bad as it certainly could have been. But this is not a role model that any of us want to emulate in any respect, quite frankly.
Life's Third Act is a podcast dedicated to helping you get the most out of your retirement. Sponsored by Tucker Allen. Here's attorney CPA Joe Cordell.
Welcome. This is Life's Third Act, and we're continuing the conversation that we left off with. For the introduction of that, go back to the beginning of the previous episode, but I think you'll enjoy this discussion. And he testified before Congress, and I think 2014, the year he died.
Yeah. Yep, that was 2014. I have the quote here if you want me to read it. Go
ahead.
Basically, he was encouraging just elderly victims to speak up about their abuse. And he said, if elder abuse, if elder abuse happened to me, it can happen to anybody. And he really stood up for, everybody who was going through any elderly victims or anything like that. And he was really pushing for Congress to enact legislation for I believe it was for harsher punishments for anybody who was, accused of elderly abuse.
Yeah. And when I look at this as an estate planner, I tend to focus more on Mickey Rooney's responsibility. I think if this were being done by a social worker, there would be much more in this video talk about ways in which Mickey Rooney was a victim in this transaction with this guy over this period of time. And I don't doubt that some of the machinations of this guy, for example, suggesting that the money was low and that Mickey needed to really cut back on his expenses and making him fearful that without this guy managing money, he would lose everything. And so there was manipulation, no question. And so there probably are videos that talk about that as it pertains to Mickey Rooney as well as others. But I don't think that there was physical abuse in this case, and we do have somebody whose cognitive capabilities are adequate. And I just think that when you look at what happened here in the context of his entire life, you really get the explanation that I think is the better lesson, the better walk-away conclusion in looking at his life. Mm-hmm. So I wrote down some things that I thought capture what I would have said perhaps to Mickey Rooney if I were talking to him at a time when there was still time for him to do things differently. And I think that the general point, overarching point is that when you have a lifetime of bad decisions, they just assure a bad ending. And that's really what this is. So often we find people make a really huge mistake at some point in their life. It could have been when they were young, they couldn't recover from it. It could be when they're older, when often you can't recover from it. But by no means is it true of everyone who ends up broke, that they all have a history of consistently making bad decisions at every turn. This is the case pretty much where we have somebody who made bad decisions at every turn.
Yes.
And you just shake your head and you think, if Mickey Rooney had given it any thought, how could it have come out any different substantively? I mean, the details could have changed. Maybe there wouldn't have been the exploitation at the very end, but we don't know what Mickey would have done with that money. And we do know what he did with the money that he had up until that point, his entire life. And he had, we should also put in context, the series of marriages, the adventures that characterize his life and relationships. As you might suspect, there were addictions involved. And the thing about addictions, especially alcohol, drugs, gambling, is that they destroy any person's finances. I mean, put aside health for a minute. This isn't a health show. This is about finances and planning for your estate. And so my focus on the impact of addictions, particularly alcohol, drugs, gambling, I should say alcohol, other drugs, and gambling, but they destroy finances. I don't know if anybody whose finances have survived those sorts of addictions. And they also destroy the best of plans, and especially estate plans. So however wonderful a plan might have been developed at any of the decade points, the 9 decades that Mickey Rooney lived and worked, there could have been a marvelous plan, but I can tell you, given his lifestyle at the time, it still would have come to naught. So he continues to gamble even as he gets older. This wasn't continuous, incidentally. There were ebbs and flows, as there typically are in people's lives who have these addictions. Rarely is it a straight line. And in his life, there were periods when it got really out of hand, but then he realized it was a crisis. He went in at one point for treatment in the 70s related to, I don't know if it's the alcohol or the drug addiction, probably both. And even the gambling he tried to get control of. There was an incident in the 70s where I think it was the Sands, and he actually lost $50,000 at a gambling table in Vegas in the early 70s. The mob boss at the time, who was, of course, watching this remotely through cameras and whatnot, was concerned. And apparently that triggered the decision of Rooney at that time or shortly thereafter to go into treatment. And he had an interest in religion that arose in the 70s. I think it was a Christian religion. I didn't research that, but I assume it'd be the Christian faith. Whatever it was something that did change his life for a period of time and may have had some enduring effect. But he never rid himself of these problems that ultimately cost him his fortune and many other things. So I would say then when we talk about key lessons, the addictions you can't ignore, all of them played a huge part in where he ended up. But I can tell you another thing that will assure poverty or at least a dramatic reduction in wealth is people who get divorced. Now, one divorce, depending on when it occurs, you can recover from often. A divorce, remember, we've talked on this show, just for the sake of discussion, we'll say it'll take the assets of whatever the net worth is of the couple involved and cut them in half. Now, assuming all those assets were acquired during the course of the marriage, then they'd be marital assets. And just for the sake of discussion, that half can go one way or another based on behaviors and culpability and contributions and things like that. But for the sake of this discussion, we'll just say cut it in half. So you imagine anything in which, look at how most of you can appreciate how compound interest works and the impact of taking a sum of money or an investment at some point and pulling out half of it, the impact that has on your projection of what that sum of money compounding over those years would have been at, say, the 20th year. So if in the 5th year, 6th year, 10th year, you take out half of that and then you continue the compounding, it's a dramatic effect. It's less than half. So the impact that divorce has on financial security, not to mention retirement, is dramatic, more dramatic than people pause to consider. But it's not simply the reduction in net worth, the halving that takes place in net worth. It's also the impact on alimony, on child support, on the costs associated with a divorce. I mean, depending on how much money you have, you can easily spend $100,000 in attorney fees on your divorce. Well, that's money that, again, comes off that compounding table that otherwise would have been a much larger sum when you hit retirement. Another impact is, again, the maintenance of the child support. Yeah, if you stayed married, you might say, well, gee, I would have paid child support, but it's different. The taxation is different when it's paid as child support. And also, I'll tell you, as somebody who has more often represented men than women, it's excessive. And it furthermore creates a situation where for both parties, they were previously taking some amount of money and spending it to maintain one household. So there's lots of economies of scale in one household. You think of the many ways. You have one house, you share a single kitchen, you share a single living room. I mean, there's so many ways in which your lawn service, it's just efficient for two people to live together and share all their expenses as a married couple does. Now divorce comes along. So you create two households, new house full of furniture. And you still, even though a child is only visiting part of the time, you have to set up a room for that child. So even if it's not a 50-50 schedule, or if it is a 50-50 schedule, there's lots of waste because there are these two bedrooms and these two sets of everything that has to exist for the child in both places. And meanwhile, there's been the cash outlay required for whoever bought the new house or the new apartment, whoever furnished it, all those duplications of utilities and everything else. So it's just very expensive to get a divorce in terms of the costs associated with it, apart from the division of the assets. Alimony. Alimony is, it can have a huge impact on your ability to save when you add to alimony, as you typically do, child support. So you put those together, you look at the fact that money is taxed now, it's taxed to the payor. So that ultimately means that pile of money that you thought you could accumulate over time, that too is reduced. So now look at the effect of what I've just said. You've wasted a good portion of your liquidity on lawyers between the two of you, and husband, you might have paid for her lawyer, depending on your ratios of income. So there goes a ton of money. You've taken whatever you've worked to accumulate and your retirement schedule, cut it in half, and develop a new schedule. And now the money that you thought you're going to be able to continue saving, reduce that substantially for maintenance and child support. So divorce is hugely costly, and it's inefficient, and it's wasteful. Now look at this guy, Mickey Rooney. Take everything I've just said, multiply it times 8 times. So it's just so foolish. And you think, what was he thinking? But he wasn't thinking. Part of it was the addictions we talked about, but I suspect his personality perhaps was such that he just, couldn't make decisions like that. So he marries 8 times. It's hard to be sympathetic with an outcome of somebody who does that. So then we have the failure to manage expenses or save. We know that apart from gambling, that he was a big spender. He spent money lavishly when he had it. By no means was he somebody who had the reputation of minimizing expenses. But beginning from the time we started earning money in the 30s, he gained control of it fairly quickly. He got his first contract when I think he was 15, the MGM contract. So he ends up getting control of that money by the time he's 17 or 18, and he wanted to live like, a guy who's successful, and he didn't minimize expenses. So that continued the rest of his life. It's incredible if he in fact had $6 or $5 million. I find that impressive, and I even question whether that was how much there was there based on his financial condition when he filed for bankruptcies. He filed for bankruptcy at least twice we know of, one of which in the 70s he listed debts that he bankrupted related to gambling expenses. That wasn't all that he bankrupted, but it included those creditors. And, that can be a threat to your safety in the early 70s, at least, when it was mob controlled. You didn't discharge those in bankruptcy with impunity because, mobsters didn't follow the federal law protecting debtors, obviously. So, but we don't know the details of that. But I'm sure he angered a lot of casinos and other places that had lent him money. And then he ended up filing bankruptcy again. I think the second time he filed bankruptcy was in 92. So that's one of the reasons I question that he had $8 million, as he alleged in the petition in the year 2000. It probably was significantly less. It may have been around the amount that was found to be owed and that was confessed in judgment by the stepson and his wife, the $2.9 million or so. But again, that was over time. One other thing that's worth mentioning is often on this show we talk about people who are famous and they have all this intellectual property. They have their brand, their name, their likeness. So those things, yeah, that's true of Mickey Rooney. If he had had somebody who was going to be conscientious to enforce that to anybody who wanted to use it or market products with him on. But he didn't really have that cachet reputationally toward the end of his life. So technically there's something there, and there still is. I assume there's been no statute of limitations expired. It's not my area of the law. But the point is, there wasn't much to be gotten. And regarding residuals or royalties, the contracts that he signed in the years when he was successful, when he was most successful up through 45, they were at what the lawyers call adhesion contracts, meaning that they're not truly negotiated. They, in an academic sense, you say, oh, this is a contract. A contract is an agreement in which two parties sit down and they negotiate. That's what you learn in law school, is a contract. But soon in law school, you start learning, now that we explain to you what this thing called a contract is, theoretically, here's the way it often works in practice. And then you start learning about what's called adhesion contracts. That's a thing you sign whenever you go in to rent a car. You notice you're not invited, you're not called back into an office and sat down with some high-ranking executive and you negotiate what you're going to pay or what the terms are or what you're liable for or the things you waive. Nothing's negotiated. It's presented to you, this quote-unquote contract, which it is a contract, but it's not mutual. So it's presented to you and saying, look, these are the terms of our deal. Take them or leave them. So adhesion contracts really mean that the person who signs it they had no option but to sign it. It doesn't mean a gun was to their head. It just means that if they wanted, in my example, if they want to rent a car, this is how you rent a car. So if Mickey Rooney wanted to be in the movies and have a contract with MGM, the biggest production studio in Hollywood at the time, this is the contract. This is what you sign. Now, I'm not saying they were all adhesion contracts at the time. Often people who had star power at that time had the ability to dictate some terms, but not much. The old studio system, as they called it, which existed up until late in the 40s, the old studio system was pretty authoritarian, and stars were owned, and they did what they were told, and it was it was a quasi. Some have analogized it to a slavery system, but it was harsh, but it was the sort of thing where you had golden handcuffs. So it's hard to feel sorry for these people, meaning, they were well paid, but they did surrender a lot of their liberty, a lot of their independence, even the way they lived their lifestyle. So Mickey Rooney didn't end up with much that he was going to be receiving later in life. He didn't have control over that, in fairness, but he did have control over a lot of decades, 9 decades of working, where he could have made better decisions. And in every decade, just almost the worst possible decisions. I mean, if you want to figure out how to be broke when you're older and have a mess of your life and have kids that all hate you, marry 8 times. I mean, it's real, and I'll throw that in, and this is just kind of the cherry on top here in terms of my criticisms. Doesn't relate directly to the money, but in a way, it definitely relates to the money, just not directly. And that's the fact that apparently he was not much of a dad. Did you see anything, Marley, about his being a great dad?
Yeah, I didn't see anything. From what I could tell, he wasn't really present most of the time,
Yeah.
and he was also paying a lot in child support, alimony, everything like that.
Which I'm sure he was routinely late on, and we didn't research that. I would bet $1,000 on that he was somebody who was inconsistent in that way. And another clue about his relationship with his kids is he disinherited all of them. I mean, his estate planning, which I should mention that now that I've focused on the most important things. As you might predict, such a person would either do no estate planning or the minimum possible. Well, that's Mickey Rooney. He did the minimum possible. Just before he died, within weeks, I think, or days, anyway, he prepares a will. There's so many things he could have done. He could have had trusts. He could have even done the will more thoughtfully. But in fairness, there weren't a lot of assets at that point. What did there turn out to be? $15,000?
Yeah, I think so.
Was one number I saw. So So Mickey Rooney, estate planning was not important to him, so he figures, well, I'll do a will. Well, he does a will, and he disinherits all of his kids. Who was the person that he gave it to? As a stepson?
It said like Mark Rooney or something. Michael
Was that
Rooney?
a stepson?
Yeah, and I read it was a stepson, and I couldn't really determine exactly what marriage the stepson was from. I think it was Jan's son because it said that his father was the father's last name was Aber, which the other stepson's name is Christopher Aber. So I
Well,
don't know if Rooney adopted that
I think that's
son.
the answer. I think that
Yeah.
he disinherited all of his biological children. He disinherited all of his biological children. So that would explain it. This is probably the one child he gave it all to was it all being $15,000 was to his adoptive child. So a couple other things I would mention here. I mentioned the failure to manage expenses or save. And then the other issue I kind of made reference to just now is don't postpone the estate planning. So over time, your mental capacity to plan declines. And as you wait longer, your options, the various ways in which you can benefit from estate planning, those options don't broaden as you get older. They narrow. So the range of things you can accomplish become fewer and fewer by waiting. And then finally, the benefits are ultimately fewer, meaning that whatever option you choose, you don't get as much bang for that buck, meaning your estate planning dollars, or bang for as a general benefit. You don't get as much of that because you started it late, and there are things you could have done with that particular approach that would have allowed you to have more. So postponing estate planning is always a bad decision, but as the saying goes, better late than never. That's a true statement. Better late than never. But don't think that late is as good as early in estate planning. There's so many more things you can accomplish if you do it early. And then finally, tying in with the points we made about the exploitation by this stepson, the fact that there was elder abuse, quote unquote, that there was some more than $5 million or more than $4 million that was taken and squandered through fraudulent means by this stepson, apparently, who signed this judgment. The bottom line is, and this is a critical lesson here, and it's separate from everything else we talked about. True, we pile it on top of here just almost every major mistake you can make. Mickey Rooney made it. And then kind of the icing on the cake at the end is, you have to pick early and you have to pick carefully the holders of any power of attorney or any trustees to manage your assets and your estate in the final years of your life. So the reason you want to do this sufficiently early is that it's very important that you be able to have the wherewithal and the relationships at the time to be able to pick well. And studies have shown that people who make those decisions in their 60s, maybe early 70s, do a much better job than people who make those decisions in their late 80s and even early 90s. And the bottom line is that your capacity to choose, tying in at the previous point, your range of options in the form of people that you would select, that often becomes more narrow as you get older. And people are around you maybe that have less reliable motives. But there are various reasons because this decision really is one of those 4 or 5 key points in your life where you want to get it right. I would say among those is choosing to get married correctly, hopefully the first time. Some, make it the second time, but marriage is one of those critical decisions. And also one of those decisions would be selecting well the people that are going to be in control of your assets as you age. It may be that you never actually hand them, put them in the driver's seat, but they're there. They've been identified. They stand willing. You've given them authority when that time comes. If you may have given them authority immediately, but they're still sitting there in the passenger seat, and you know that the moment that you can't drive anymore, you can pull over, you can get out, you can change seats and continue on your way safely. So it's so beneficial to have formed those relationships. And it doesn't have to be one person that you have this ability to look into the future, with this magic looking glass and know that this one person you can count on to be there until you die. No, you do have your number one preference, but you have your number two and number three and maybe even number four. So it's true when you pick early, there's a chance that person may not be around at that time. They may not survive you, for example. That's okay. You still choose people in the order of your preferences, and you know that it's very likely such a person will be unavailable. And to the extent you decide to change that later on, of course you can change it. But you want to have a trust in place, and of course you want to have a will in place, and you want to have a durable power of attorney in place so that somebody can immediately pick up for you and take care of you the moment something precipitous happens. It could be a heart attack, a stroke, whatever it may be. Immediately somebody's in a position to take charge. Now, Mickey Rooney, I will say this for him, despite the many bad decisions he made, he was fortunate in many ways. First of all, he's fortunate because he could act and he could continue working despite, his lifestyle and all the other bad decisions. He still was in a position to keep working because of his talent, to keep working late in life. But he also had the good blessing of health. He couldn't have known this. And I'm convinced it's not because he took care of himself. I mean, I've seen pictures of him, and many of you have, later in life. And it doesn't look like he's somebody who's spending a lot of time working out in health spas and et cetera. But he had apparently good genes, I guess. And so here he is. He's in a position to continue working. So it could have been worse. He could have been broken in an old folks' home. But instead, he is able to work. I mean, that's a terrible plan to count on that. None of us should be counting on the fact of our being able to work until the last day we die. That's not a good plan. Even if it were possible and we could know that, who would want to have to do that? Who would want to have on your shoulders that responsibility? Wouldn't it be better that even if you could work, you don't? You don't have to at some point? It's called retirement. So many of us think that's a good idea. But Mickey Rooney was blessed. He was blessed with his talent as an actor. He was blessed with his health. So all things considered, though his decisions were awful, God was apparently looking out after him, and it wasn't as bad as it certainly could have been. But this is not a role model that any of us want to emulate in any respect, quite frankly. So you can tell I'm not a fan of Mickey Rooney's, personally, I should say, and as a role model. So such is the case when we look at some of these stars, as we have in celebrities. We find some positive role models, and we find some negative role models. So Mickey Rooney was on the negative side of that scale. Well, on the positive side, which we did just recently, was Frank Sinatra. Frank Sinatra did a lot of things right. So it will continue to do that. We don't want just negative examples. We like to show you some positive examples, but even the negative examples typically don't get as bad as Mickey Rooney. So there you have it. I hope this was interesting as well as educational and beneficial. This has been another episode of Life's Third Act. Till next time, take care.
You've been listening to Life's Third Act, a podcast for thriving in retirement. Sponsored by Tucker Allen, your estate and elder law advisors. Each week, we discuss topics and answer questions to help you better plan for your future. For more information, visit tuckerallen.com. Subscribe and listen again next week for another edition of Life's Third Act. The choice of a lawyer is an important decision and should not be based solely on advertisements.